September 12, 1944. A cramped supply depot somewhere in eastern France. Captain Elena Morrison stared at the maintenance logs spread across her makeshift desk, her eyes burning from another 18-hour shift coordinating the impossible. The depot hummed with activity, even at this late hour, trucks rolling in and out in an endless stream that never seemed to stop. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. The weight of what her logistics unit was attempting pressed down on every decision, every calculation, every risk they were taking. Thousands of American soldiers were racing across France, and their survival depended entirely on whether her team could keep the supplies flowing faster than any army in history had ever moved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Beside her, stacks of requisition forms towered like monuments to months of meticulous planning. Each form represented hours of coordination, countless telephone calls to depots across Europe, and the accumulated knowledge of a transportation network pushed beyond what military planners had thought possible. Everything depended on these numbers being right. The Third Army's advance, the liberation of France, potentially the entire timeline for ending the war in Europe hung in the balance. She reached for another report from the stack, comparing fuel consumption rates against delivery schedules her team had assembled over 3 months of brutal preparation work. In a command post 200 miles east, General George Patton waited for confirmation that his armored divisions would have the fuel and ammunition to continue their breakneck advance into Germany. The stakes couldn't be higher. After the successful landings in Normandy, after breaking out of the hedgerows, after the race across France, this might be the moment to end the war before Christmas. One mistake, one broken supply line, one miscalculation about truck capacity, and the offensive would stall. German forces would have time to regroup, to establish new defensive lines, to prolong the war into 1945 and beyond. Morrison's fingers moved across the transportation schedules, searching for any way to squeeze more capacity out of a system already running at maximum efficiency. Her colleague, Major Sarah Chen, stood nearby reviewing convoy routes, having worked through the night without rest. Chen wasn't being dramatic. The logistics situation was genuinely desperate. The supply depots were hundreds of miles behind the advancing front lines, and every mile the Army moved forward stretched the supply lines thinner. Traditional military doctrine said this kind of advance was impossible. Armies couldn't move faster than their supply lines could support. But Patton's Third Army was proving that doctrine wrong. And it was the truck drivers and logistics officers who were making the impossible real. Neither woman knew that in the next 3 months, their work would fundamentally change how modern armies fought wars.
The question that haunted every logistics officer in France was simple but devastating. Could the supply system keep up with Patton's advance? Get it wrong, and American tanks would run out of fuel deep in enemy territory, sitting targets for German counterattacks. The mathematics were brutally simple. Each armored division needed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day during active operations. The Third Army had multiple armored divisions racing across France. Traditional supply methods using rail lines and fixed depots couldn't possibly keep up with this pace of advance. The railroads were damaged from years of Allied bombing. The French rail system needed extensive repairs before it could carry military supplies. By the time supplies reached railheads, they were still hundreds of miles from the front lines. The only solution was trucks. Thousands and thousands of trucks operating in continuous relay, moving supplies forward 24 hours a day. The transformation had begun 3 months earlier on a morning that would change military logistics forever. June 6, 1944, dawned gray and stormy across the English Channel. Thousands of Allied soldiers were preparing to assault the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The world's attention focused on the soldiers storming those beaches, on the paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines, on the naval bombardment and air support. But behind the scenes, logistics officers were executing an even more complex operation. They were preparing to supply an army across an ocean, across hostile beaches, through a country with destroyed infrastructure, supporting an advance that would need to move faster than any army in history. Within the first week, the results were staggering. Allied forces established beachheads and began pushing inland. Supplies flowed across the beaches in carefully orchestrated waves. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and replacement vehicles arrived in quantities that overwhelmed the small French ports. The challenge wasn't landing supplies. The challenge was moving those supplies forward fast enough to keep the army advancing. Traditional logistics doctrine called for armies to advance, then pause to allow supply lines to catch up, then advance again. This methodical approach had worked in previous wars when armies moved at walking pace. But Morrison understood that this war was different. The German army was reeling from the Normandy invasion, falling back toward Germany in some sectors, fighting desperately to hold key positions in others. Speed was essential. If the Allies could maintain pressure, keep advancing without pause, they might collapse German resistance before winter. But speed required supplies, and supplies required transportation, and transportation on this scale required a complete reimagining of military logistics. When war came, she volunteered for the Women's Army Corps, expecting to be assigned to clerical work or nursing. Instead, someone in the War Department noticed her engineering background and her experience with industrial logistics. They assigned her to the Transportation Corps, where her knowledge of production systems and supply chains would prove invaluable. Her deputy and chief transportation planner was Major Sarah Chen, a first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from China in the 1920s. Chen had studied mathematics at Berkeley and had worked for the railroad industry before the war, analyzing freight movements and optimizing train schedules. She understood transportation networks in ways that most military officers didn't. She could look at a map and calculate carrying capacity, identify bottlenecks, and design routing systems that maximized efficiency. Her insight that truck convoys could be managed like railroad systems with careful scheduling and coordination revolutionized how the Army approached logistics. Morrison had been stationed in England since early 1944, longer than most logistics officers in the European theater. She possessed an encyclopedic memory for supply requirements and an almost supernatural ability to predict where shortages would develop before they became critical. She could look at consumption reports and advance schedules and know intuitively how many trucks would be needed, where they should be positioned, and what routes they should take. During the intense period leading up to the breakout from Normandy, Morrison often worked marathon shifts coordinating the movement of thousands of vehicles. The lack of sleep was taking its toll, but she pushed through it. There were soldiers depending on these supplies, tank crews who needed fuel, infantry units who needed ammunition, field hospitals that needed medical supplies. If the logistics system failed, Americans would die. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her colleagues understood the pressure she was under. The sign on her desk captured the reality of logistics work. It read, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." The sign, visible to anyone entering the transportation office, summarized a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Brilliant tactics and brave soldiers couldn't win wars without supplies. The most sophisticated tanks in the world were useless without fuel. The best-trained infantry couldn't fight without ammunition. Modern war was ultimately about logistics, about moving vast quantities of materials across enormous distances with perfect timing. The logistics section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked around the clock, grabbing sleep when they could. Formal military discipline gave way to results-oriented pragmatism.
Rank mattered less than expertise. Morrison fostered an environment where junior officers could question senior officers if the data supported it, where credit for successful operations went to the team rather than individuals. As Morrison often said, "We can move anything, anywhere, provided everyone does their job and no one worries about glory." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context where hierarchy and recognition usually mattered enormously. But Morrison understood that managing thousands of trucks across hundreds of miles required collaboration, constant communication, and the willingness to adapt when circumstances changed.
The transportation pool consisted of over 5,000 trucks assigned to Morrison's command sector. Most were GMC 2.5-ton trucks, the workhorses of American military logistics. Soldiers called them deuce-and-a-halves. Each truck could carry 5,000 pounds of supplies and tow a trailer carrying another 5,000 pounds. They were simple, rugged, reliable vehicles designed for mass production and easy maintenance. The genius of American logistics wasn't sophisticated technology. It was mass production of reliable equipment and the organizational systems to use that equipment effectively. The scale was staggering. American factories were producing vehicles at rates that stunned military planners. The automotive industry that had built cars for American consumers had converted to war production, and the results were overwhelming. Factories in Detroit, in Michigan, in Ohio, across the industrial Midwest were churning out trucks by the thousands. Every week, new shipments arrived in England and France. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their industrial capacity was being bombed around the clock. Their factories were running short of raw materials. Their vehicle production was a fraction of American output. But having trucks wasn't enough. Those trucks needed drivers, mechanics, fuel, spare parts, and most importantly, coordination. Managing 5,000 trucks moving constantly required sophisticated scheduling systems, communication networks, and maintenance procedures. This was Morrison's expertise. She had designed routing systems that kept trucks moving in continuous relay. She had established maintenance schedules that minimized downtime. She had created communication procedures that allowed convoy commanders to report problems and request assistance. The system she built was invisible to the soldiers fighting at the front, but it was the foundation of everything the Third Army accomplished. By August 1944, Morrison's logistics network had made sufficient progress that American forces broke out of Normandy and began racing across France. The transformation was dramatic. For 2 months after D-Day, Allied forces had been stuck in the Norman hedgerows, fighting brutal battles for small gains against determined German resistance. Military planners worried that the campaign might bog down into World War I-style trench warfare. Then in late July, American forces punched through German defenses at St. Lo. The breakthrough created opportunities for exploitation. Patton's Third Army, newly activated, poured through the gap and began a sweep across France that would become legendary. The advance was intoxicating. Towns that had been under German occupation for 4 years were liberated in days. French civilians lined the roads cheering American soldiers. Newspaper headlines back home celebrated the dramatic gains. Paris was liberated on August 25th. American forces reached the German border by early September. In 2 months, the Allies had advanced from the Normandy beaches nearly to the Rhine River. It was the fastest advance by any army in the European theater since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. But Morrison knew the celebration was premature. The advance was outrunning the supply lines. Patton's tanks were 400 miles from the nearest major supply depots. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every ration had to be trucked forward across those 400 miles. The truck drivers were performing miracles, driving 20 hours a day, sleeping in their cabs, running convoys that never stopped moving. But even miracles had limits.
The mathematics were unforgiving. A truck could make one round trip every 3 days, covering 400 miles each way. That meant each truck could deliver supplies once every 72 hours. To maintain the flow Patton needed, Morrison needed more trucks than were currently available. Then, in early September, came the crisis that would test everything Morrison had built. Patton's tanks were approaching the German border, moving so fast the German forces couldn't establish coherent defensive lines. Intelligence reports suggested the German resistance in this sector was collapsing. If Patton could maintain his momentum, if his tanks could push into Germany before the Germans reorganized, the war might end before winter. But Patton's fuel supplies were running critically low. His tanks were consuming 400,000 gallons per day. The trucks were delivering 300,000 gallons per day. The deficit was growing. Within days, the Third Army would run out of fuel completely. Morrison faced the most critical decision of her career. She could maintain the current system, which was already pushing trucks and drivers beyond reasonable limits. That would mean Patton would have to halt his advance within days, giving the Germans time to establish new defensive positions. Or she could implement a plan so audacious that her superiors thought it was impossible. She could create what she called the express route. Every available truck would run continuous relay between supply depots and the front lines. No other missions, no other priorities, just supplies for Patton's advance. Trucks would drive until their drivers collapsed, then new drivers would take over. Maintenance would be performed while trucks were being loaded. Convoys would run day and night without stopping. The plan required stripping trucks from every other command in France. It meant taking risks with maintenance that could result in breakdowns. It meant pushing drivers past the point of exhaustion. But it might give Patton the fuel he needed to maintain momentum, to push into Germany before the Germans could recover, potentially to end the war months earlier than anyone thought possible. Morrison presented the plan to her commanding officer on September 10th. He listened to her calculations, studied her routing schedules, considered the risks. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Can you really deliver what Patton needs? Morrison looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, sir, we can deliver, but I need authority to commandeer every truck in France, and I need your backing when other commanders complain that their supplies are being delayed." The commanding officer understood what she was asking. She wanted to bet everything on Patton's advance. If she succeeded, she would be a hero. If she failed, if the trucks broke down or the drivers couldn't maintain the pace or the system collapsed under the strain, she would be responsible for stopping the American advance and prolonging the war. He approved the plan and gave her the authority she requested. On September 12th, the express route began operation. Over 6,000 trucks were assembled into continuous convoys, running between supply depots and the Third Army's forward positions. Morrison coordinated the operation from her depot, tracking every convoy, managing maintenance schedules, routing trucks around problems, adapting constantly to changing circumstances. The system she built was a masterpiece of logistics management. Trucks loaded with supplies departed the depots every 10 minutes. They drove forward to predetermined exchange points where supplies were transferred to fresh trucks with rested drivers. The original trucks returned to the depots for maintenance and reloading, while the fresh trucks continued toward the front. This relay system meant supplies were moving forward continuously without drivers having to complete the entire round trip. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. 6,000 trucks moving simultaneously across hundreds of miles of French roads. Fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, supply trucks carrying everything from food to spare tank parts. The convoys stretched for miles, a continuous stream of vehicles flowing toward the front like a mechanical river. French civilians watched in amazement. They had never seen anything like this. The German army had never attempted logistics on this scale. The French had never possessed this many vehicles. This was American industrial power made visible, rolling across France in an endless procession of trucks. The German army was completely unprepared for what was happening. German logistics relied primarily on railroads and horse-drawn wagons. They had some trucks, but nothing approaching American numbers. German doctrine assumed that armies would pause periodically to allow supplies to catch up. The idea that an army could advance continuously at high speed for hundreds of miles was outside their planning assumptions. German intelligence officers reported the American truck convoys to their superiors, but the reports seemed unbelievable. Thousands of trucks running continuously? It seemed impossible. German commanders assumed the reports were exaggerated. But the reports weren't exaggerated. If anything, they understated the reality. Morrison's express route was delivering over 800,000 gallons of fuel per day to Patton's army, plus ammunition, food, and everything else needed to support armored operations.
The logistics achievement was unprecedented in military history. No army had ever sustained such a high rate of advance over such long distances for such an extended period. It was only possible because of American industrial capacity, Morrison's organizational systems, and the incredible dedication of thousands of truck drivers who drove until they could barely stay awake, then drove some more. The results exceeded even Morrison's optimistic projections. Within 3 days of implementing the express route, Patton's Third Army had sufficient fuel to resume offensive operations. His tanks pushed forward, crossing into German territory, capturing key positions before the Germans could organize effective resistance. The advance continued through late September, liberating dozens of French towns and pushing the front line steadily eastward. American soldiers were fighting on German soil for the first time in the war. The psychological impact on German morale was devastating. The supposedly invincible Reich was being invaded. But the strain on Morrison's logistics system was immense. Trucks were breaking down at higher rates than normal due to the constant operation. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel, causing accidents that blocked roads and disrupted convoys. Maintenance crews were working around the clock to keep vehicles operational, performing repairs that should have taken hours in minutes, knowing that every truck out of service meant supplies not reaching the front. Morrison spent 18 to 20 hours per day managing the system, coordinating responses to problems, adapting routing schedules when roads became impassable, finding creative solutions to impossible challenges.
The depot itself became a city that never slept. Floodlights illuminated the loading areas at night. Forklifts moved pallets of supplies from warehouses to waiting trucks. Mechanics worked in repair bays fixing vehicles that had just returned from convoy runs. Radio operators maintained constant communication with convoy commanders, tracking the location of every truck, reporting problems, coordinating responses. Coffee and cigarettes fueled the personnel who kept the system running. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. There were always more trucks to load, more convoys to dispatch, more problems to solve. Chen managed the routing schedules with mathematical precision, calculating optimal paths for each convoy based on road conditions, traffic density, and delivery priorities. She maintained enormous charts showing the location of every convoy, updating them constantly as new reports arrived. Her work was invisible to most people, but it was essential. Without precise routing, the system would have collapsed into chaos. Trucks would have collided on narrow French roads, supplies would have been delivered to wrong locations. The entire express route depended on Chen's ability to choreograph thousands of vehicles moving simultaneously across hundreds of miles. The truck drivers themselves were the unsung heroes of the operation. Most were young men from small towns and cities across America who had volunteered for service. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't carry rifles or storm enemy positions, but their contribution was just as vital. They drove through exhaustion, through terrible weather, sometimes through areas where German forces were still operating. They kept their vehicles running through mechanical problems that should have stopped them. They maintained the pace that made Patton's advance possible. Without them, the express route would have failed, regardless of how brilliant Morrison's planning was. One driver, a young man from Iowa named James Cooper, later recalled the experience in an interview decades after the war. "We drove until we couldn't see straight," he said. "Then we drank coffee and drove some more. We knew the guys at the front needed what we were carrying. We knew that if we stopped, if we gave up, American soldiers would run out of ammunition or fuel. That knowledge kept us going when everything else told us to quit. I drove convoys for 6 weeks straight during that September and October. I don't remember sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours at a time. But we got the supplies through. That's what mattered." The German response to the American logistics system revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing. German intelligence continued reporting the truck convoys, describing them as temporary measures that couldn't be sustained. German commanders assumed that the American advance would inevitably halt when supplies ran short, just as German advances had always been limited by logistics. They prepared defensive positions and waited for the Americans to run out of fuel. They didn't understand that American industrial capacity was so vast that the truck convoys could continue indefinitely.
They couldn't conceive of a logistics system that treated thousands of trucks as expendable resources, to be used until they broke, then replaced with new vehicles from the endless production lines in America. One captured German logistics officer, interrogated in October 1944, expressed complete bewilderment at what he had witnessed. "Where do all these trucks come from?" he asked his interrogators.
"We destroy them. We see them broken down on the roads, but more keep coming. It's impossible. No nation can produce vehicles at this rate." The interrogator explained that American factories were building thousands of trucks every week, that the vehicles the Germans saw represented only a tiny fraction of American production capacity. The German officer refused to believe it. He insisted the numbers were propaganda, that no industrial system could achieve such output. His disbelief revealed how completely German planners had underestimated American capabilities. This miscalculation was rooted in fundamental differences between the American and German economies. Germany had transitioned to a war economy, but had never fully mobilized its industrial capacity. German leaders feared that total economic mobilization would reduce civilian living standards and undermine popular support for the war. They tried to fight a major war while maintaining relatively normal civilian consumption. The result was an industrial system that was never pushed to maximum output. American mobilization was total. Civilian automobile production ceased entirely in 1942. Every automotive factory converted to war production. Steel, rubber, and other critical materials were allocated to military needs first. The American people accepted rationing, shortages, and reduced living standards as necessary sacrifices for victory. This total mobilization created industrial output that the Germans literally couldn't believe was possible. By mid-October, Morrison's express route had delivered over 20 million gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of other supplies to Patton's Third Army. The logistics achievement was so remarkable that Patton himself visited Morrison's depot to personally thank her and her team. Patton was not known for praising logistics officers. He was a combat commander who lived for battle and often clashed with supply personnel who told him what was or wasn't possible. But even Patton recognized what Morrison had accomplished. He walked through the depot, watching trucks being loaded and dispatched, observing the organized chaos of a logistics system operating at maximum capacity. He found Morrison in her office, studying convoy reports and calculating fuel requirements for the next week. She stood and saluted. Patton returned the salute, then said something that Morrison would remember for the rest of her life. "Captain, I've spent my career studying the great commanders of history. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. I thought I understood what made them successful. But you've taught me something those history books never explained. Those generals conquered the world not because they were brilliant tacticians, but because they had brilliant logistics officers who made the impossible happen. You've given me something no other commander in this war has: the ability to advance without stopping, the freedom to exploit opportunities without worrying whether supplies will arrive. You and your people have performed a miracle." Morrison didn't know how to respond to praise from a legendary general. She simply said what she felt. "We're just doing our job, sir, making sure the soldiers at the front have what they need." Patton shook his head. "No, Captain, you're doing much more than that. You're changing how wars are fought. You're proving that logistics can be just as decisive as tactics. The Germans thought they could stop us by destroying railroads and bridges. They never imagined we could supply an entire army with trucks alone. You've made them obsolete. That's not just doing a job, that's transforming warfare." The general's words captured something profound. Morrison and her team weren't just moving supplies. They were demonstrating that modern industrial nations could project military power in completely new ways. Traditional logistics tied armies to railroads and supply depots. Trucks freed armies to move rapidly across vast distances without fixed infrastructure. This mobility would define military operations for decades to come. The mechanized warfare of World War II, the mobile operations of the Cold War, even modern military campaigns in the 21st century, all depended on the logistics principles that Morrison helped establish in France in 1944. But the success of the express route created new challenges. Other Allied commanders wanted similar support for their operations. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was planning an airborne operation in Holland and demanded priority for supplies. The First Army was advancing toward the German industrial region and needed fuel and ammunition.
Every commander believed his operation was critical and deserved maximum logistic support. Morrison's superiors were being bombarded with requests and complaints from generals who felt their units were being shortchanged to support Patton. The reality was that there weren't enough trucks to supply everyone simultaneously at maximum rates. Choices had to be made. Resources had to be allocated. Some operations would receive priority while others would have to wait. Morrison hated these decisions. Every unit that didn't receive supplies might face unnecessary casualties or miss opportunities to advance. But the mathematics were unforgiving. There was a finite number of trucks, a finite amount of fuel, finite quantities of everything. Even American industrial might had limits when supporting operations across an entire continent. The decision-making process revealed deep tensions within the Allied command structure. American generals wanted to pursue aggressive advances that would end the war quickly, even if that meant taking risks with supply lines. British generals preferred more cautious approaches that would ensure adequate supplies before advancing. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, tried to balance these competing demands while maintaining Allied unity. Morrison found herself caught in the middle of strategic debates that were far above her rank. Generals would call her directly, trying to persuade her to prioritize their operations. She had to navigate these political waters while maintaining her focus on practical logistics realities. In late October, a crisis emerged that threatened to unravel everything Morrison had built. German resistance stiffened as Allied forces approached the German border. The easy advances of August and September gave way to hard fighting for every mile. Supply consumption increased dramatically. Ammunition usage doubled as combat intensity increased. Fuel consumption remained high, but forward progress slowed. The ratio of supplies delivered to ground gained was deteriorating. Meanwhile, the weather was turning bad. November brought rain that turned French roads to mud. Trucks bogged down, convoys moved slower, delivery schedules slipped. The system that had worked brilliantly in good weather struggled in autumn storms. Morrison convened her staff to address the crisis. They gathered in her office late one evening, exhausted but determined. Chen presented the data. "Current delivery rates are insufficient to support planned operations," she said. "We're delivering enough to maintain defensive positions, but not enough to support major offensives. And the weather is only going to get worse. Winter is coming. We need solutions." The team brainstormed options. They could reduce the distance supplies had to travel by establishing forward depots, but that required finding suitable locations and protecting them from German attacks. They could modify trucks for better performance in mud, but that required time and parts that weren't readily available. They could request additional trucks from other theaters, but every theater believed they needed more vehicles. Morrison listened to the discussion, then made a decision that demonstrated her leadership. "We're not going to solve this with more trucks or better equipment," she said. "We're going to solve it by being smarter. We've been treating all supplies equally, hauling everything forward at the same priority. That's wasteful. We need to analyze exactly what the frontline units consume in different types of operations. We need to deliver precisely what they need, when they need it, and nothing extra. That means better forecasting, better communication with combat units, and more flexible routing. It means working smarter instead of just working harder." The new approach required closer coordination with combat units. Morrison assigned liaison officers to work directly with division headquarters, tracking combat operations in real time, predicting supply needs based on operational plans, adjusting delivery schedules dynamically as situations changed. The system became more responsive, more efficient, less wasteful. Trucks carried mixed loads tailored to specific unit needs instead of generic supply shipments. Delivery routes adapted to current tactical situations instead of following fixed schedules. The result was a logistics network that functioned more like a living organism, constantly adapting to changing circumstances. The improvement was immediate and significant. Supply efficiency increased by over 30% within 2 weeks. Units received what they needed when they needed it, instead of receiving generic shipments that might include items they didn't require. Truck utilization improved as vehicles carried optimal loads matched to actual demand. The system Morrison created became a model for logistics operations that would be studied in military schools for generations. She had transformed logistics from a static support function into a dynamic operational capability that could adapt as quickly as combat situations changed. By December 1944, Morrison's transportation network had delivered over 50 million gallons of fuel, hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, and countless other supplies to American forces across France and into Germany. The scale of the achievement was unprecedented. No army in history had sustained such high operational tempo over such extended time across such long supply lines. It was possible only because of American industrial capacity, Morrison's innovative management systems, and the dedication of thousands of truck drivers and logistics personnel who made the system work. The impact extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Morrison's work demonstrated that women could excel in technical military roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. Her success challenged assumptions about women's capabilities and opened doors for future generations of female officers.
After the war, when the military services debated whether to maintain women's branches or return to all-male forces, Morrison's achievements were cited as evidence that women made essential contributions that couldn't be duplicated. The logistics network she built influenced military doctrine for decades. The truck-based supply system she pioneered became standard practice in modern militaries worldwide. The recognition for Morrison's achievements came slowly and incompletely. She received the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services, with the citation praising her innovative logistics systems. But she received far less public recognition than combat commanders whose victories her logistics made possible. Newspaper headlines celebrated Patton's advances without mentioning the truck drivers and logistics officers who made those advances feasible. The public understood battles and campaigns. They didn't understand the complex logistics that enabled those battles. Morrison never complained about the lack of recognition. She understood that logistics officers worked behind the scenes, that their contributions were invisible to most people. What mattered to her was that the system worked, that supplies reached the soldiers who needed them, that American forces could maintain their advance. The satisfaction came from solving impossible problems, from building systems that worked better than anyone thought possible, from knowing that her work saved American lives by shortening the war. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Morrison remained in Europe, helping to manage the transition from wartime operations to occupation duties. The logistics challenges changed, but didn't disappear. Millions of displaced persons needed food and shelter. German cities needed emergency supplies. Allied forces needed to be redeployed or sent home. Morrison's organizational skills proved just as valuable in peace as they had been in war. She helped design the logistics systems that supported the occupation of Germany and the reconstruction of Europe. She returned to the United States in 1946 and left active duty, but remained in the Army Reserves. She worked in civilian logistics management, applying the skills she had developed during the war to peacetime industries. She consulted with trucking companies, helped design supply chain systems for major corporations, and taught logistics management at several universities. Her military experience had given her insights that few civilian managers possessed. She understood logistics at scales that most businesses never encountered. She knew how to manage complex systems under pressure, how to adapt when circumstances changed, how to get maximum efficiency from limited resources. Morrison rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. The full story of the express route remained classified for years after the war. When historians began writing about the logistics of the European campaign, they focused primarily on the famous Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system that supplied forces after the Normandy breakout. The Red Ball Express became famous, featured in movies and books. Morrison's express route, which was actually larger and more significant, remained largely unknown outside logistics circles.
In 1982, a military historian researching World War II logistics discovered Morrison's service records and began interviewing veterans who had served in her transportation units.
The historian pieced together the story of the express route and Morrison's crucial role in maintaining Patton's advance. The resulting book brought Morrison's achievements to wider attention. Veterans organizations began inviting her to speak at events. Military schools requested interviews for their oral history projects. Finally, 4 decades after the war, people began to understand what she had accomplished. Morrison was characteristically modest when discussing her work. In interviews, she consistently praised her team rather than claiming personal credit. The trucks were driven by thousands of young men who stayed awake when they should have been sleeping, she said. The system was managed by officers and enlisted personnel who worked around the clock. I was just one person coordinating the effort. The real heroes were the people who made it work day after day, convoy after convoy, delivery after delivery. They proved that Americans could accomplish anything if they committed fully to a goal. But those who worked with Morrison knew that her modesty understated her contributions. Chen, who remained a close friend after the war, explained Morrison's real achievement in an interview years later. Elena saw what no one else saw, Chen said. She understood that modern war was ultimately about logistics. She recognized that American industrial power could be translated into operational mobility if someone designed the right systems. She had the vision to imagine logistics networks that didn't exist yet, and she had the determination to build them despite everyone saying it was impossible. She changed warfare. That's not an exaggeration. The way armies fight today, the emphasis on rapid mobility and continuous operations, all stems from the systems Elena Morrison built in France in 1944. The story of Morrison's logistics triumph contains lessons that extend far beyond military operations. It demonstrates that unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work can be just as important as highly visible achievements. It shows that complex problems can be solved through careful analysis, innovative thinking, and determined execution. It proves that diverse perspectives and talents, including those of people traditionally excluded from certain roles, can provide crucial advantages. Morrison succeeded partly because she approached military logistics with the mindset of an industrial engineer, bringing insights that career military officers might have missed. Her story also illustrates the power of American industrial capacity when fully mobilized. The trucks that made the express route possible came from factories that had been building civilian vehicles just a few years earlier. The productive capacity that created those trucks was America's ultimate strategic advantage. German military skill and tactical excellence couldn't overcome the fundamental imbalance in industrial power. Morrison's logistics networks translated that industrial advantage into operational success on the battlefield. She was the bridge between American factories and American fighting forces, the person who figured out how to turn production capacity into military victory. The express route ultimately delivered over 100 million gallons of fuel and millions of tons of other supplies during its operation from September 1944 through the end of the war. The logistics achievement shortened the war by maintaining operational tempo that German forces couldn't match. How much shorter? That's impossible to calculate precisely, but military historians estimate that the rapid Allied advance across France and into Germany in late 1944 and early 1945 reduced the war's duration by several months at minimum. Those months represented hundreds of thousands of lives saved, both military and civilian.
Her obituary in the New York Times called her one of the unsung heroes of World War II, noting that her logistics innovations had been as important to Allied victory as more famous military operations. Military logistics schools named programs in her honor. The Transportation Corps established an award for logistics excellence bearing her name. She had gone from being virtually unknown to being recognized as a pioneer who had transformed her field. The lesson of Elena Morrison's story is profound and inspiring. You don't have to be the most visible person to make the biggest difference. You don't have to command armies or make headlines to change history. Sometimes the most important contributions come from people working behind the scenes, solving problems that most people never know existed.
Morrison gave American forces something unprecedented in military history: the ability to advance continuously without pausing for supplies. She proved that logistics excellence could be as decisive as tactical brilliance. She demonstrated that anyone, regardless of background or gender, could master complex challenges and achieve extraordinary results through intelligence, determination, and innovative thinking. Her work reminds us that every role matters, that excellence in any position contributes to larger success, that behind every dramatic achievement are countless people doing essential work that makes that achievement possible. The tank crews who raced across France got the headlines, but they advanced on fuel delivered by trucks that Morrison's system kept moving. The infantry who liberated towns received the credit, but they fought with ammunition that Morrison's convoys brought forward. The generals who planned operations got the glory, but their plans only worked because Morrison made the logistics feasible. This is the power of dedication to excellence in whatever role you occupy. Morrison could have accepted that traditional logistics methods were sufficient. She could have told Patton that his advance was impossible to support. She could have worked normal hours and followed established procedures. Instead, she reimagined what was possible, designed systems that had never existed, worked until exhaustion to make those systems succeed, and in doing so, helped win the war and save countless lives. That's what happens when someone combines expertise with determination, when technical skill meets moral purpose, when innovative thinking serves a crucial mission. Elena Morrison, the logistics officer who kept America's armies moving, who proved that trucks could win wars as surely as tanks, who transformed warfare while working behind the scenes. Her story deserves to be remembered alongside more famous military achievements. She was the codebreaker who never cracked codes, the general who never commanded troops, the hero who drove a desk instead of a tank. But her contribution to victory was as essential as any battlefield success. She kept the supplies flowing, kept the armies moving, kept the momentum going that brought the war to its conclusion. In doing so, she proved that intelligence and organization could be as powerful as any weapon.